You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Well, welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. A podcast where I just hit the button to play the music once more on accident. If you just heard that little echo. Fat fingers, you guys. All right, so today's another solo episode. We're going to talk today about Walter Russell. If that name's ringing a bell to anybody, it's probably because the actor Terrance Howard was on the Joe Rogan podcast not long ago. And in that podcast, he talked about all kinds of crazy shit. Partly, some of that shit was Walter Russell. So I got a little book. It's not little at all. In fact, it's giant, the Universal one. I hate when they publish books like that. But in any case, it just doesn't fit on the bookshelf at all. It's just like this is a giant fucking book. I got a copy of the Rig Veda that's like that. It's like, why? Why do you got to make the book so large? In any case, if you guys remember Terrance Howard, the actor, I don't know what he's best known for. I remember him specifically from the Iron Man movie, but he's been around a long time and has done things before and after. I think he was on a popular show for a while. But I saw him pop up here and there with various videos online where he was talking about the flower of life. If you guys have seen any of those videos, I think he was giving a speech to graduating class of some college. I don't really remember the details, but I've seen my brother sent me a few of them. And he's talking about some esoteric ideas. He's talking about some strange scientific ideas. But really, he's talking about things like the mysteries that are yet to be acknowledged in science, but in all those avenues in which we understand the world. You have a lot of buttoned-up academics that won't allow themselves to be religious at all. They won't allow themselves to be mystical at all. They kind of they keep all that under wraps, even if they think those ideas, you wouldn't know. And so Terrance Howard is coming on the Joe Rogan podcast to talk about a revolution in science. And he's got all kinds of interesting things in that podcast specific to patents that he has been awarded, and there's dozens of them apparently. He was demonstrating some ridiculous technology, this design of what do they call those? What word do I use? For those people who've seen it, you already know what I'm talking about. Sometimes I struggle for words. It is a system of carrying heavy things from place to place, and the little flying devices, drones, I guess is the word I was looking for. They connect to each other and they fit into one another, so that you can kind of make as large a flying device as you need to be able to pick up and move a heavy object. So the heavier the object, the more of these things you need. And he demonstrated how these things would work. And the inspiration for the design comes from Terrance Howard's own mystical experience. He said he saw these things in his memory palace, for lack of a better phrase. He could go somewhere within his own mind where he has access to all this information. And he says that he's had access to that information since he was a child. Some really interesting stuff there. So if you haven't seen that episode, I strongly recommend it. I think it's very entertaining. Whether you buy any of it or not, I think it's very interesting and worth a watch. So Terrance Howard introduces flaws in modern science, gaps. And it's some stuff that we've heard before. I mean, we talked about Philip Goff's book, Galileo's Error. And the error he's referring to is the fact that the practice of science was limited, that it wasn't going to allow, in his argument specifically, the union of mind and matter. So we had to keep those realms separate. Well, if that's the case, if we have to do that, then whatever progress we might have in science, by unifying those two ideas somehow, whatever exploration that might make possible, we're just never going to do. Because, the scientific paradigm says that the world is matter and spirit is nonsense. So, mind is supposed to be an emergent phenomenon of matter. It's not supposed to be fundamental. And so it's unscientific to think about those things as maybe one. And we've talked about this in terms of Descartes as well. We can go on and on. The point is, there are these interesting people in the world, in history, who have tried to reconcile science and religion in one form or another, or science and spirituality, that there's recognizing a component to being, a component to our experience in our lives that is more than the material, and that mind has something to do with that. And it's not a super big leap for us to kind of understand that. Like, we know that our thoughts and ideas are not physical objects in the world. They're not associated with matter in and of themselves, even if there's some correspondence in the matter of our brains and the chemistry of our brains and so forth. That an idea by itself is hard to explain in terms of material physics. And there's been lots of interesting people like that. We've talked about Tesla, we've talked about Alfred Wallace, we talked about people like Swedenborg and Humphrey Davy, and just all kinds of sort of mystical scientists. And I love that. I really think that's an interesting path. I think it's something that should be explored more. There should be less stigma in the scientific community around it, and there should be more philosophy and science done with this in mind. And so Terrance Howard is one of these people, and he admits that a lot of his inspiration has come from a couple of other historical thinkers, and one of them is Walter Russell. So we're going to talk today about Walter Russell. I'm going to kind of introduce this book, The Universal One, that specifically mentioned, I believe, on the Joe Rogan podcast. He wrote lots of other books. Another one I ordered recently, so maybe there'll be some more Walter Russell stuff to come once that book gets here. So anyway, let me just tell you a little bit about Walter Russell, and then we can get into this. Walter Russell was born in 1871. He died in 1963. He was actually an artist his entire life. This isn't something like he wanted to be an artist, or he was an artist when he was younger. He was an artist his entire life, and kind of a Renaissance man of artists, if that's a thing. He's somebody who dabbled in lots of different types of art, and he was skilled and accomplished in lots of different types of art, which we'll get to. So let me just keep going. He attended art school both in the United States and in Paris, and I think it was in Massachusetts where he went to school. Then he went to Paris. He played the organ. He conducted and taught music. He was a decorated painter, sculptor, and a prolific author. He wrote children's books early on, and then many books on science and mysticism, one of which we're going to talk about today. He designed and built buildings and monuments. Now, he even worked as a motivational speaker for IBM. I mean, what kind of a person has all of this to their credit? And, maybe try to imagine what that kind of person would be. It's not the kind of person I think you can write off. It might be, because he's an artist type, the kind of person that says some out there stuff, some kind of person that, I say out there stuff, but to him, it's not out there. But things that aren't going to be easily digestible by the public, and he's just saying them, doing them. You know how artists are. But he's also somebody who designed buildings and monuments and, sculptures, and he was a motivational speaker for international business machines, for Christ's sake. Like a person that can do all of that. What kind of person is that? I don't think it's a quack or a kook or somebody you can write off. The same story with Swedenborg and Sir Humphrey Davy and some of those other mystics that were also scientists. You can't write them off as much as you might want to. Okay, so in 1921, Russell has a mystical experience. And you know how I feel about that. I think that's a very important phenomenon, mystical experience. Maybe it's the most important phenomenon. And he had one. And not everybody does, but he did. And I love those stories of people who do. There's a Canadian doctor named Maurice Buck who wrote a book called Cosmic Consciousness that's filled with this sort of thing. But I mentioned Humphrey Davy and Swedenborg before. Those are other people who have had mystical experiences. They all talk about them in very similar ways, and it's very strange that there's so much overlap in between these what you might consider hallucinatory experiences that, people separated by space and time who don't know each other, would have. So some interesting stuff. He has a mystical experience in 1921, and this is how he describes it. I was able to find a couple of brief quotes in the wiki. He said that during that period, I could perceive all motion. Now, we're going to talk a lot about motion today from a scientific perspective, and it's some of the more dense and difficult stuff here that we're going to cover. So I just want to point out that when he had this mystical experience, it surrounded this idea of motion, and it was that he could perceive all of it. Now imagine, motion is associated with action, activity, it's associated with life. Locomotion is something that's associated with living things. So think about the cellular motion, the molecular motion. Think about the atomic motion of the electrons, and think about the vibrations that's going on. Think about the spinning of the planets and the spiraling of the galaxies and all of the motion on the smallest level and on the largest level, all through space and time. Think about all of the motion that's going on. And Walter Russell said he perceived in his mystical illumination, he perceived all motion. And what that means in a mystical perspective, and it's kind of an interesting way of describing it, but what that means from a mystical perspective is that he experienced what it is to be everything all at once. He became the all. He had that experience of being God, even that momentary glimpse of it. This is what the mystical experience is all about. It's about a divine and cosmic unity, and recognizing that you are and always have been a part of this unity, and that all things that you think are different from you are just some other reflection of the same cosmic unity. And it has this effect of merging identity. It has to do with identity, what you identify with. So he has this experience of all the motion. He became the universe, one with the universe, this experience. But for him, it was specific to motion. This was what he latched a hold of. This is what was unique to the experience for him and what inspired a lot of what we're going to talk about today. All right, so Walter Russell's scientific writings have not been accepted by mainstream academics, not in the 1920s when he was writing this, not in the modern day. When Terrance Howard spoke about this on the Joe Rogan podcast, he talks about having a conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson about it and how critical Neil deGrasse was, completely unwilling to even entertain this idea. I did watch a video that Neil deGrasse made. It's a short video, like 15 minutes long, as a rebuttal to Terrance Howard's interview with Joe. And I thought it was fair, actually. But what Neil deGrasse does is he says, look, there's flaws in your basic premises, so I refuse to give any attention to any of your conclusions or anything in between. Even if there's valuable stuff there, it's a non-starter for Neil because he doesn't agree with your premises. And I think that's fair to a certain degree. But I've said it before and I'll say it again. I have my problems with Neil deGrasse Tyson as a public speaker, as a public figure. I don't think he captures or even permits the awe that science is meant to inspire in people. The seeking, right? The seeking and the searching and the quest. That's what science is. And for Neil, he doesn't seem to want people to do that. He wants people to stay in the mold that the scientific tradition has laid out, and you can progress along that path only. Anything going on in the fringes is unacceptable. And the problem is that all of the greatest advances in science happen on the fringes. All of the greatest advancements in any domain happen on the fringes. And Walter Russell's certainly a character on the fringes. Okay. Walter Russell was awarded a copyright for his redesign of the periodic table of elements. This is something Terrance Howard talks about in the Joe Rogan podcast, shows images of. There's images of this in the book. It's fantastic as far as I'm concerned. I don't understand it well, but I certainly hope to understand it better, and I could share that with you guys. But there's kind of an interesting story, if you guys don't know, regarding how the periodic table that we use today came about. It was invented by a Russian fellow named Mendeleev, I believe is how you say his name. But if I'm remembering correctly, he had a vision or a dream of how the elements are related to each other. And when he woke up or came to, he put that down on paper, and then it was elaborated and eventually becoming the periodic table that we see today. So it was kind of a unconscious revelation, kind of a mystical experience, you might say, that Mendeleev, and that inspired the periodic table that we use. Walter Russell thinks that it's flawed, and he's come up with, he doesn't claim to have come up with it, but for it to have been revealed to him that the proper way of understanding the elements is totally different. And if you understand how they're organized, it reveals so much more about what can be done with them, how they can be manipulated, and a better understanding of how the world is put together and how chemicals and elements interact with each other and all this stuff. And so he was able to get this patented, this new vision of the periodic table of elements. And again, it's organized in this spiral pattern, right? So everything's sort of spiraling down, on it, rather than having this sort of two-dimensional grid that's laid out by atomic weight, which is what we see when we look at the periodic table today. It's something very different. And then Walter Russell said this. He said he believes that the cardinal error of science was shutting the creator out of his creation. I think that's beautiful. I agree. It reminds me of another quote. Now I'm going to forget who said it. It's something along the lines of, when physicists are studying the universe, they want to study objectively what's there and not and avoid anything subjective. So what they do is they try to rely on data and the results of experiments and take their subjective experience out of it, right? The data from experimentation, and then they take their subjective view out of it. The problem is, and this is the criticism of science that I think is powerful, is that consciousness is part of the universe. In fact, it's what we're using to design these experiments and record the data and so forth. And what they're doing is pretending that consciousness doesn't exist. It's not a part of the universe. And so the study of physics or objective reality has taken consciousness out of the equation. But you can't really do that. If you want to study the cosmos includes this phenomena that we call consciousness. You have to account for it. And trying to avoid that so that you can be quote-unquote objective is actually a big error. And that brings me to the first section, which I'm going to call Galileo's error. All right, so Walter Russell starts off in this way. He says, "The supreme service which man can render to man is to answer the great heretofore unanswerable question concerning the one universal force which man calls God." He says, "Voltaire said that man could never comprehend God, for he must be God to comprehend him. But man is God." Okay, the hair stands up on my arms. So this is how I want to begin here. He's saying that if only the enlightened person, if only the prophet, if only somebody who has some understanding of God can effectively share that with the world, with humankind, that it would be the greatest benefit to mankind possible. And Voltaire's objection is, well, that can't be done, because only you would have to be an omniscient being like God to understand what it is God is. And Walter Russell's retort to that is, but we are God. Now, only a mystic says that. Only a mystic says, but man is God. And And if that's the case, Voltaire's objection falls. So Walter says, man of today is a bearer of heavy burdens, sweating at heavy labor because of his ignorance. Knowledge of the one will lift the yoke which man has placed on his own shoulders. This knowledge is herein written down in the language of a new science, which explains the heretofore unexplainable. Right, so Walter Russell is claiming here to do what he just suggested would be the greatest benefit to mankind ever, is to explain to him the heretofore unexplainable, about the mystery that is God, that he's calling the one universal force. This is something also you're only, maybe not exclusively, but certainly always among the mystics, going to hear God described as the oneness, the divine unity. You know, everything all together, taken all at once, all of the potential for the future, everything that has been, everything that is, rolled up into one, that ball of potential, that's the thing that we're calling God, that thing that unfolds and becomes the cosmos. Is this one unity. And so that's also a telltale sign of a mystical experience. He says, fundamentally wrong in its basic premises, man's modern concept of the universe must be torn down and built again. Man conceives life as spontaneously generated in matter under favorable conditions. Such concepts are not true. Wrong concepts of the atom's structure and the modern electric theory, of energy and its transmission, of conductivity, radiation, and gravitation, must be remodeled on truth. So, quite a big statement, right? Walter Russell is saying that so much of the premises on which modern science is built and our understanding of the cosmos and our place in it, so much of our premises are wrong that we have to demolish and rebuild the whole system of knowledge. And he's going to propose to do that in what he calls the language of a new science. A science that takes into consideration the divine, the spirit, the realm of spirit that exists alongside, or maybe one with, this realm we call matter. He says, mind and matter are one. There is but one universe, one mind, one force, one substance. This unity is God. He says, God is mind. Okay, interesting. Not unique, but interesting. When he says mind and matter are one, I find that interesting, not only because all of this insistence on the oneness, one universe, one mind, one force, one substance, that harkens back to that mystical unity. So, you can see how that's being emphasized over and over and over because it made such an impression on him, as it does when you have that experience. And that unity you're experiencing is the thing we call God. But then he says God is mind, and mind and matter are one. So God is mind and God is matter. Of course, God is everything because God is one. But the way he explains this is important because it shows you his grappling with this mystical experience, how he's trying to make sense of this mystical experience. I've done this myself. I've done this on this podcast. I've read my notes about my own mystical experience, just read them to you. And I've talked about how I tried to make sense and grappled with that experience for years to come to the position that I am in today. And this is what we're seeing in this book. When he says God is mind, I said this is not a unique idea necessarily. I brought up that Canadian doctor, Maurice Buck, he coined the term cosmic consciousness. So maybe you've heard this phrase before, or if you are more of the psychologically minded, maybe you enjoy my stuff on Carl Jung, you might think of it as the collective unconscious. So whether we're talking about cosmic consciousness or the collective unconscious, there's this idea of mind at large. Mind not limited by or connected to matter or body, mind as such. And the best way of understanding this, and I think this is what Walter Russell is going to call it, is the mind of God. And we've heard that lots. We've heard that with the pre-Socratic philosophers talking about this concept they call nous. It's like the mind of God, the place where the archetypes exist, the place where the forms, the Platonic forms exist. It's a spiritual domain. It's a mental domain. And so this is this idea of mind at large. The nous, Alfred North Whitehead also talks about the mind of God in various ways. So you see it over and over again. All right, then he says this. Remember, mind and matter are one. God is mind. Then he says, thinking is the cause of motion, and states of motion are registered in light. Man calls this matter. Matter is light. Nothing is which is not light. All right, so this is one of those moments where, if you follow me this far, the rational-minded, the scientific-minded people might be willing to just sort of drop it right here. Like, what do you mean? Thinking is the cause of motion and everything is light? What are you talking about? So let me do my best here. When he says thinking is the cause of motion, remember, he's talking about thinking, but not necessarily like I'm thinking right now or you're thinking. He's talking about the universe, right? The one. He's talking about the mind of God. So the thinking he's talking about is not mundane thinking like what you and I are doing. It's God's thinking. It's something else. God's thinking. He says that is the cause of motion. And by motion, I think he means something a little bit larger than that. From a scientific perspective, he means something like action, change, transformation. Motion is that, again, that telltale sign of life, that telltale sign of order. Everything's in motion, right? The electromagnetic radiation, the spinning of everything, the effects of gravity, everything's in motion. So he says that motion, the stuff that we think about when we think about life and the cosmos and order and sacred geometry and all of this sort of thing, all of that comes from the mind of God. They're the thoughts in the mind of God. And then he says something stranger. He's like, those states of motion, the different thoughts streaming forth from the mind of God, are registered in light. Now, we're going to talk more about what he means by this, but when I first encountered this, I'm like, registered in light? Like, what are you talking about? And then it dawned on me that registered means something like encoded, right? So God's thinking is encoded in light. So there's this connection between thinking and motion and light. So perhaps, and again, when we think about light, what we're talking about are waves in motion, right? Light is an electromagnetic wave in motion. So there's a fundamental connection between light and motion anyway. So God's thoughts are something like light in motion. And depending on what he's thinking, the form of that light is going to be different. A different form for a different thought, let's say. So his thoughts are encoded in light. And what that means is how the light is moving. And that might sound maybe mundane or unimportant, but how the light is moving means everything. Because how the light is moving makes the difference between one color and another. When we think about light more broadly, we're talking about electromagnetic radiation. Light is just one piece of that spectrum, visible light. It goes into the ultraviolet and so forth. There's more to it. So if we're talking about electromagnetic radiation in motion, what we're talking about then is what makes the difference between one element and another, right? Its frequency changes. And that makes the difference between one element and another. Now you start to see how important variations in motion or frequency really are fundamental to how things exist, or even that things exist. And that's interesting. And then when he says nothing is which is not light, I think what he's, again, more broadly saying is nothing is which is not electromagnetic radiation. Of course, that he believes is the thoughts of God, but nothing is which isn't electromagnetic radiation. And I can't help but be reminded of, Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. You have in the equation the speed of light, which is interesting. We're talking about an equivalency between energy and mass, or energy and matter. And I know many scientifically minded people want to put their hand up and say, no, there's a difference between mass and matter. E equals mc squared is not saying that energy is equal to matter, but it is. It is. I mean, matter has mass. That's its distinguishing characteristic. Matter wouldn't be matter if it didn't have mass. What makes matter matter is the fact that it has mass. So energy is equal to matter times the speed, mass times the speed of light squared, or whatever it is. You're basically suggesting, and Einstein is suggesting, that energy and matter are equivalent or can be converted back and forth to one another. This is the basis for the atomic bomb and nuclear energy. I mean, of course, this is fundamental to reality. The electromagnetic radiation, energy, it has this equivalency with matter, just like Walter Russell just said, mind and matter are one. God is mind. And the speed of light, light is in this equation. Isn't that interesting? Why? I've always wondered. There's a lot of interesting things about light from the perspective of physics. I mean, light represents in its motion something like the order or limit to nature. Nothing moves faster than the speed of light. So light somehow represents the outer boundary of what's possible. There's something about light that is fundamental to reality, such that we're using the speed of light in the formulas that we use to understand it. All right, Walter Russell says, the universe is a multiplicity of changing effects of one unchanging cause. It's a hell of a sentence. The universe is a multiplicity of changing effects of the one unchanging cause. So this is kind of hearkening back to this philosophical problem of the one and the many. Like, if you believe God is one, which he clearly does, he's a mystic, and he said so over and over again. If God is one and God is all there is, how is it that there are things apart from God? How is it that there are distinctions at all? How is it that there's a world and you and me and all these things that are distinct from each other that fill it up? How is that possible if everything is one? And so his response here is, the universe is a multiplicity. So he's recognizing there are more things, but those things are effects. Effects. These are changing effects of the one unchanging cause. So you might say something like this. The universe is a multiplicity of thoughts of the one God. Because that's what he's saying. The changing effects, the multiplicity, are the thoughts that are emerging from the mind of God, which is permanent and unchanging. So what he's saying here is that the universe literally is God's thinking. God's thoughts are manifest. They're incarnate. God thinks and poof, his thoughts become reality, because the space in which those things exist, what we call outer space in the cosmos, is, to Walter Russell, the mind of God. And if you can close your eyes and let's do it right now, close your eyes, to make a cube appear in your mind's eye and make it green. Do you see it? Now imagine in the mind of God, you think about the green cube and it's immediately there, right? just like it is in your mind, your mind's eye. It's immediately there. But in the mind of God, that immediately there is a real physical object. This is what he's saying, more or less. The universe is literally God thinking. And the motion and action and change that we see in nature literally are the flow of God's thoughts. Isn't that interesting? Now, I want to do this a couple times here because partly this is an illustration of the fact that Walter Russell is wrestling with these ideas and trying to understand them. And I know this, I recognize this because I've been through the same exercises where it's like a semantic disaster, really. It's struggling with words and the meanings of words and associations of meanings with words and trying to make equivalencies between them so I can understand them. But the equivalencies are never perfect. And I guess what I mean is, as you're wrestling to understand this mystical experience and its implications, that sort of a thing takes place. It's like, how is it everything is one? And it's going to cause you to make equivalencies and to wrestle with ideas. And so up to this point, what Walter Russell has said is that God is one. That oneness that God is mind and matter. It's also light. So all of these words, I want you to build for yourself a cloud of associations. This word G-O-D is right in the middle. We don't really understand what that means. That word is a numinous thing. It's hard to pin down. Everyone has a different idea of it. So let's just say this is a word that we don't know what it means. God. And then surrounding this word are all of these associations. So we can try to piece together what is common among all of these associated ideas to come up with a better understanding of what God is. He's saying God is one. It's mind and matter as one thing. It's light. And I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to try to give you this expanded list of associations as we move through. Right now it's mind and matter and light. All right, he says, the universe is a tonal one, a dimensionless universe of light. It is a series of orderly tonal periodicities of the one force registered in light. All right, so we're hearing some of the things we've heard already, but let's just try to break this down. When he says that the universe is a tonal one, I immediately thought of music. But I don't think this is what he means. But again, maybe there's some associations to music, so maybe it's not an improper analogy. But when he says the universe is a tonal one, what he means is that it's based on tension. That's what one way of understanding what tonal means. The universe is based on tension, right? It's like the tension between opposing forces, something like that. And we hear, that should be familiar to you when we talk about the Ouroboros and the syzygy and all these things in our earliest myths about the union of opposites and the Ouroboros. It's about this tension, the union of opposites. It's like trying to put the positive and negative sides of a magnet together. There's force and motion being created by the tension of opposites. He calls it a dimensionless universe of light. When he says that it's a series of orderly tonal periodicities of the one force registered in light, this orderly tonal periodicities, a series of them, by the way, to me sounds like a recurring tension, a back and forth, some kind of a process or even a dance, right? So, these opposing forces, like the opposing sides of a magnet, you put them together and that's kind of what you get, right? You get this dance, this back and forth, this process. And this resonates, with my own mystical intuition. I have thought of trying to make sense of the experience has led me to think of the cosmos and God as a process, as though the cosmos and God are the opposites that we're talking about here. creator and creation, that they're both eternal, that they're always existing together inseparably. They're mutually counterdependent. That's how I would put it. And what we call experience, existence, life, is exactly this dance, this tension of opposites, creator and creation. And it's a back and forth thing. Why? Because there isn't actually a distinction between creator and creation. Remember? God is one. Everything is one. It's sort of an internal tension. And of course, he says this is registered in light, which is he's going to explain is how mind or God becomes matter. So I'll save that, but moving on. He says, light is the universal language in which the divine concept is written. Man's most wonderful instrument, the spectroscope, has told him little, for he has not yet learned to read it. He does not know that those many lines of light are letters of the alphabet in which God registers his mighty thinking. The hair stands up on my arms. All right. When he says light is the universal language in which the divine concept is written, those are obviously God's thoughts. Written is this idea of encoding or registering in light what these thoughts are, giving form to them. And then he talks about how we've invented the spectroscope. I don't know if you've seen this, but it basically gives you the spectrum of light associated with anything. Maybe it's a distant galaxy, and you want to know what elements are on that. You can look in the spectroscope, and you can see these lines of different colors of light and gaps between them. And being able to read that tells you what elements are present on that distant star or on that distant planet. But the same thing is true for anything you look at. The spectroscope is going to give you what he's calling letters of the alphabet in which God registers his thinking. Those lines, the pattern of colors of lines and gaps can be read. And what you're doing is recognizing the pattern that God's thoughts encoded into that light, that made them physically real and manifest and material, which we're going to get to in a bit. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call creation. You'll see why. This is a bit, when I read it, I just sort of nodded along because my own mystical experience, the notes that I took from my own mystical experience, they sound a lot like this. So I just sort of nodded along. But let me just give it to you. He says, in the beginning, God. God is the universe. God is not one and the universe another. The universe is not separate. It's not a separate creation of God's. It is God. Right? So what you have here is a kind of pantheism, which is an idea that basically means God is the cosmos. They're equivalent things. Or maybe even a variation of this, which is called panentheism. So it's not exactly like God is equivalent to the world, but God is imbued in the world. So everything that exists has got God in it. That includes the cosmos. And so it starts off with this biblical phrase, in the beginning, That's why I'm calling this creation. He says, in the beginning, God. He can kind of stop there if he wants to. But he doesn't. He says, God is the universe. God is not one and the universe another. The universe is not a separate creation of God's. It is God. So God and the universe are equally eternal things. It wasn't like there was a beginning of the universe, because the universe is one with God and God is eternal, if that makes sense. He says, in the sense generally understood, God did not create anything. This is a creating universe, not a created one. Man's concept of a material universe, different in substance from the spiritual universe, is a misconcept. God is all there is. God is all there is. A more mystical statement has never been made. That's it. You summarize it just like that. And when he says God didn't create anything, kind of harkens back to what I said before. It's like God is the universe. They're two halves, or two sides of one coin, let's say. So the universe couldn't have come into being. It has to be eternal along with God because it is God. And so God didn't create anything, at least in the way that we generally think about creating something. But then he says something interesting. He says, this is a creating universe, not a created one. Right? So it's like, this just reminds me of Alfred North Whitehead. It reminds me of his process philosophy. We've talked about that in the past. I don't know how much I have to recap for you, but Whitehead saw the universe as a process. That's what he calls it. And it's like a process of perpetual self-creation. Right? The universe creates itself. It is its own cause, and it's its own impetus for change and transformation. The process of evolution and chemical reactions and all the things that happen, it's all built into it. It's a creating universe. Like the universe is unfolding and evolving for the same reason we might write a story or poetry, because the universe is a creating universe. That's what it does. And a creating universe is something like God. God is a creator. It's difficult to call God a creator and also something created. And that's what the universe is. That's what, when we think of it as having a beginning, that's kind of the realm we put ourselves in. A created thing. And then he says that the material universe is not different from the spiritual one. That matter and spirit are one thing. And we have a philosophical school called panpsychism that is basically exactly this idea. And it's related to Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy. It's also related to idealism, and we're going to see more of that too as we move along. But let me not get too far ahead of myself here. The last statement in this section is this. He says, God is in reality and exists in substance. God is mind and is expressed in light. The substance of God is light. It is a tangible substance, a thinking substance. Spirit is light. Matter is light. God is light. And he doesn't just make this last statement willy-nilly. When he says God is light, he actually references John 1:5. So he's taking this from the Bible, and if you want to know what that scripture is, it's, in God was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. We could talk more about that, but that'll take us on a tangent. But the point is, when he says, in God was life, and the life was the light of men, you get this association between God and light, and that's what he's saying. God is light, spirit is light, matter is light. So you have this equivalency again with spirit and matter, mind and matter. It's a very panpsychist thing to say. But let me start in the beginning of this here, where he says, God is in reality and exists in substance. Like I'm putting emphasis on in because this is what he's emphasizing. You know, we think about God, especially in a Judeo-Christian perspective, as something transcendent, something different from, apart from the cosmos, the material world. Maybe so different from it. You know, it's like there's nothing in common about matter and spirit. They're completely different universes. And what Russell's saying, no, God is in reality. He's in substance. What that means is that God is not transcendent, the way we think about God floating up above everything, you know, as a witness to it. You know, that would be the image you would need if you thought of the cosmos as being created by God. But Russell doesn't quite think that. He thinks of God as immanent in the world. And in fact, this is what we see in the Bible. The Bible says that in the beginning, the Spirit of God was on the surface of the deep. Right? When the cosmos is created, God is in it. The Bible tells us that. In it. And when God creates man, he breathes the Ruach Adonai, he breathes himself into the form of Adam, right? God is in Adam. He's in the world. He's in Adam. God is in matter and in substance, is immanent in the cosmos. That's the point he's making here. And then he says God is mind, and mind is expressed in light. The substance of God is light, right? So God's thoughts that manifest in the world is light. That's the substance of God, the substance of mind at large, this cosmic consciousness. He says it's a tangible substance, right? This light that we're talking about, it's a tangible substance. That means matter. And he says it's also a thinking substance. That means mind, right? So light is mind and matter as one thing. And that thing is the substance of God. God is mind and matter, right? That unity. And E equals MC squared is telling us something similar. Matter and energy, as some sort of a equivalency. Then he says the universe is energy and is expressed in light. So you have this God is expressed in light and the universe is expressed in light. So you have this equivalency between God and the universe. It's a very clear pantheism, like Baruch Spinoza and Alfred North Whitehead. All right, so here I want to give you this new cloud of association surrounding the God. God, the oneness, the unity, is mind and matter, light, life, energy, and spirit. Now these are the cloud of associations that have built from where we left off. And that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call life. So we just read this biblical phrase here, and God was life, and the life was the light of men. So that brings me to life. Walter Russell says, there is but one life. The whole of the universe is but one living, breathing, pulsing being. Right? Things are alive, but that life is one thing. What makes me alive and what makes you alive is not different things. There's only one life. The entire universe is one living, breathing, pulsing being. This is exactly what Alfred North Whitehead described in his process metaphysics. He says, there are not two lives or two living beings. All that is one. Life is a property of mind. Life is immortal and is in all matter in the elements and atoms. So when he says life is a property of mind, and earlier he said that God is mind. So life is a property of God. And this is exactly what John 1:5 says. In God was life, and life was the light of men. It's interesting, right? He says, life is the effect produced by the electromagnetic pulsations which constitute thinking. Right? Who's thinking? We're talking about God's thinking. So God's thoughts are this electromagnetic pulsation, light and motion. And life is somehow in that. It's in that process. It's part and parcel to it. So what he's saying is that God's thoughts are alive. They're things that we might call spirits. And I love that because Carl Jung, when he talked about the archetypes, which there's equivalency between that term and Plato's forms, but also spirits, Jung said that the archetypes are living, independently living. Now I get this sort of fractal picture here, where God's mind produces living things that are his thoughts, and those things are you and I in the world. But then we have our own living archetypes. In our own mind, we have these spirits, these motivational forces that are living within us. As you see this reflection, as above, so below, the old Hermetic dictum. And the life of God is present in his manifest thoughts, right? Because everything is one. If God is life and mind is life, when those thoughts emerge, they're really not distinct from God, and so they inherit the life that God is. And this is how all matter is seen as living, which is the case with Walter Russell. It's also the case with Alfred North Whitehead. He says this effect is registered in light and manifests itself in all matter. He's talking about life. It's part of what's encoded in light. And he says all matter is evolving, growing, living. All matter. Even the inorganic, even the stone sitting there, And, you can straw man that if you want and say that, inorganic material is not living and, there's no argument that it is living and it doesn't locomote, it doesn't eat, doesn't defecate, it doesn't do any of the things that living things do. But that's just a matter of scale. I mean, you go down to the molecular level and you're going to see motion and action. You're going to see something that looks a lot more like, fitting the definition of life. He says, the substance of mind has the appearance of many states of motion, which man calls the elements of matter. The elements do not vary in substance. They vary only in their states of motion. All right, so there's a lot packed in here, but this is sort of one of those things that pushes back against scientific orthodoxy. When he says the substance of mind has the appearance of many states of motion, the implication is if they're only appearances. So when we look at the substance of mind, when it becomes material, when it's encoded in light and becomes material, those things are the elements. Hydrogen, helium, whatever, the elements. That they're only the appearance of different elements, different atoms. That's only an appearance. The reality is still something like that unification, that divine unity, the oneness. But the appearance is not nothing. It's important. And this is where we start seeing some of this idealism coming through. Something that looks like, the kind of philosophy you see in Hinduism from the Upanishads, or the type of, like the philosophy of the German idealist philosophers that come around, like Hegel, as an example. People that believe that the world of our experience is something like an illusion. It's what the movie The Matrix was trying to describe. The world of our experience is something like illusion, and what's real is something else, something that the illusion keeps us from recognizing or seeing, something that the mystical experience shows you. The veil is lifted, and you see the truth of reality, which is this oneness. Everything is God. All right, he says, the elements do not vary in substance. They vary only in their states of motion. Now this, again, partly scientific orthodoxy agrees, right? The elements do not vary in substance. Well, we think of atoms as made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So, yeah, they don't really vary in substance. He says they vary only in their states of motion. Now, that's different, right? The atomic theory that we believe today says that they vary in their constitution, right? There may be more protons or whatever, more electrons, or there's some difference in their constitution that makes the difference between one atom and another. But Russell's saying, no, that's one of these false premises of scientific orthodoxy. It's not that they're constituted differently. It's that their states of motion are different. This has to do with the frequency and motion of the electromagnetic wave that makes up their reality, their being. It's that makes the difference between hydrogen and helium, not a different number of protons, neutrons, or electrons. And that may be enough for a modern scientific-minded person to dismiss Walter Russell. Maybe this is kind of where you stop listening. But what I would suggest here is that there might be something interesting and there might be something to be learned about testing this theory. Then we would be on the fringes. Then maybe we would we learn something we couldn't have known before under a different paradigm. So is it the case that atoms vary in their motion? Well, I think even scientific orthodoxy would say yes. There is some truth in that. The question is, how deep is that truth, and what does that mean? Now, if you take Walter Russell seriously, then maybe you can explore that. But nobody's doing that. Certainly, Neil deGrasse is not encouraging anyone to do that. All right, last bit in this section, he says, all motion is in equilibrium, but has the appearance of being divided into opposites. So here you see that word appearance coming up again. So when he says all motion is in equilibrium, I don't know what that means to you, but it's kind of like I'm picturing like an old grandfather clock and the pendulum and the clock. When I think of, motion to the left, tick, motion to the right, talk, when I think about an equilibrium being met, if a state of equilibrium being reached, in my mind that pendulum kind of stops moving. Like the equilibrium is the spot right in the middle where it's not ticking and it's not talking, it's perfectly balanced. And what happens there is motion and equilibrium is not really motion at all. It's like you're taking the tick and the talk, you're taking the opposites, and you're putting them together, right? They cancel each other out. You get this equilibrium, but then the motion is gone. And I think that's important. I think it's tied to his how he elaborates about the appearance of being divided into opposites. It's like, this goes back to this idea of the Ouroboros I've explained many times, but it's like if you take the opposites and you merge them together, if you take all things and you merge them together, what you're left with is something that seems like nothing, right? There's just like this state of equilibrium where motion is balanced. It seems like there's no motion there anymore. It seems like you've gotten rid of the motion. It's like when you take hot and you take cold and you put it together, you seem to not have temperature at all anymore. It's like you take all of the colors under the rainbow and you put them together, and what you end up with is white light that seems to have no color in it at all. It's like you've gotten rid of the color by putting them together. There's something here that is an analogy to God. It's what is meant by God being one, or the oneness. It's when you put everything together, what you have is something that seems like nothing, but in reality is the potential for everything. And that nothing is the most significant thing there could possibly be, the potential for everything. So here he says all motion is in equilibrium. That kind of means that motion doesn't exist. But it has the appearance of being divided into opposites. It has the appearance of ticking and talking, if you see what I mean. So the appearance is the motion, is the thing that we would latch onto and say, this is the real thing. This is something that's happening. And what Walter Russell is saying is, no, that is actually just an appearance. It's something like an illusion. And that is exactly a summary of idealism as a philosophy. That there's something real, and that real thing is behind what seems to be the real thing. The appearance, that's what seems to be real. The material cosmos, the world of my experience. But what's really real is something behind that I can't see. Something that seems like nothing. Because it's potential. All right, now he's going to introduce some interesting concepts that are going to get into the kind of the difficult part of this, I think. He says, motion in opposition is under either electric or magnetic domination. So it's asymmetrical. He calls this motion in opposition. This is that appearance, that a tick and a talk that we're talking about. This is the appearance, he says, motion in opposition, right? Moving between these two opposites, or between the two opposites. And this motion is caused by an imbalance of electric and magnetic force. There's an asymmetry involved. Now, if you don't know this, I'll just tell you, we didn't know for a long time that electricity and magnetism were in fact one thing. We call that electromagnetism today. But for a long time, we didn't know that. So remember, when he says it's under either electric or magnetic domination, Electricity and magnetism are one force. So there's this back and forth, this asymmetry within this one thing, electromagnetism. And this is an analogy to what he's describing about the nature of God and the cosmos. It's more than an analogy, but it is one. Motion in opposition. He says it's a state of motion where pressures are unequalized and sustained by the resistance of the two opposing forces in motion. Now, this is something that Terrance Howard talked about on the Joe Rogan podcast, pressures. Obviously, he got that as well from Walter Russell. I don't really understand what he means by this. When he says motion in opposition is a state where pressures are unequalized, I think he's talking about this sort of asymmetry when he talks about, either being under electric or magnetic domination. There's some sort of asymmetry he's pointing to, but I don't really know what the pressure is meant to denote. I mean, I would need a physicist on here to ask that question. I don't really know what he means by that. But the asymmetry involved, the difference in pressures, he's saying, this inability to find equilibrium or something like that, that it sustains the resistance of these two opposing forces. It sustains the motion, the perpetual motion that we see everywhere. Motion in our thoughts, motion in our growing and evolving, motion of the planets, motion of the atoms, all of it, right? And then he contrasts this idea of motion in opposition with what he calls motion in inertia. He says this is equally electric and magnetic. So it's something like the tick and the tock, the motion equilibrium of the pendulum being right in the middle. It's not moving, right? Motion in inertia is not motion, really. It's the potential for motion. It's what you might call potential energy as opposed to kinetic energy, right? It's the potential for motion. And that's what exists when everything is balanced. Like when the motion seems to disappear and not exist at all, what's happened is it's just stepped back into this state of potential. He says neither force dominates. It's a state of motion where pressures are equalized. But then he says this: life belongs to motion in opposition. Death belongs to motion in inertia. So you see, when the equilibrium is achieved, the motion seems to stop. Right? And that's something associated with death. Life belongs to motion in opposition, which makes sense because that's where the motion activity is. But remember, motion in opposition. Where was I going with that? He describes it as appearances. Right? So life falls into this category of motion and opposition. And that's something he's described as appearances, as illusory somehow. Now, I think that's interesting because mystics will often talk about death this way. Not usually life, but they'll talk about overcoming death, conquering death. That's the message that's the Christian message, essentially. But the conquering of death is realizing that death doesn't exist, that things don't stop, that they just transform and keep going, that you are God, and when you die, God doesn't die, it just continues. And so there's something very mystical about this as well. That brings me to the next section. We've got a couple left. This one I'm going to call Music of the Spheres. And again, I think this is where it's the most challenging for me, so bear with me. Walter Russell says, motion runs the gamut of periodic and opposing deceleration and acceleration in 6 full tones, 1 double tone, and a master tone, to each of 10 lowering octaves. All right, so you see what he's doing here. He's talking about motion, but he's describing it in a way that I would associate with music, right? He's like, motion has all these possibilities, but those possibilities are organized in 6 full tones, 1 double tone, and a master tone to each of 10 lowering octaves. So motion is sort of subject to this order, this pattern. And it's the same pattern we see in nature, as an example, in music, in harmony. He says the 7 tones are those so-called elements of matter, right? So we know, right, it's the motion of light that makes the light one thing instead of another. So the motion of light following these patterns make up what we call the elements of matter. He says the master tone is the record of all motion taking place within the octave. He says they are the turning points between action and reaction. They are the beginnings of each new expression of energy and motion. The master tone of each octave is the inheritance of the original motion of the thinking process of mind. And these master tones are the inert gases. The state of motion of these inert gases is motion in inertia. That state of pressure equilibrium which lies between any two masses. So you see what I mean. All right, so motion is described in the same way that music is described, and it is patterned in the same way that music is patterned. And so you kind of have this fractal picture as well, which I expect to see in nature, and I think that's beautiful. It's represented in mystical experience, and we see it here. I'm not surprised by that. And when he's talking about these master tones having like a record of all of the motion in that octave, it also reminds me of Alfred North Whitehead when he talks about experience building, because for him, matter is experience. It's also something happening in the mind of God, and experience is always building, so that there's a record, right? It's like there's always a record of any new thing, because it's made up of the things that came before it, the experiences that came before it, that come together to make this new thing. Every new thing is created that way, to Alfred North Whitehead. So there's a record of it, of all of the past, and any novel new creation, any novel new experience. And we get something like that here in this description of master tones. Then he says the master tone of each octave is the inheritance of the original motion of the... So I just sort of described that already. Then he says these master tones are the inert gases. So, okay, so I think about taking all of the motion, putting it together, and achieving some equilibrium, right? Remember, the tics and the tocs, if we put them all together, we come to this state where pressures are equalized, and they seem to go away. Right? We lose the motion in the balance, in the equilibrium. And he calls the master tones, he describes them this way, right? He says that they're the inert gases, right? Remember, if the motion of light makes it hydrogen or helium or whatever, and the motion reaches a state of equilibrium, then it's not, obviously it can't be hydrogen and helium anymore, because the motion isn't there anymore. Right? The motion is now balanced, and so what you have is a new element, what he calls the inert gases. Now, if you know anything about the inert gases, you know the reason they call them inert or noble is because they're unreactive. They don't react with other elements. He says the state of motion of the inert gases is motion in inertia. This is potential, right? It's not moving. It's got the potential for motion, but it's not moving. This is why they're not reactive. And so light in a state of equilibrium like this make up those elements, those parts, constituent parts of the material cosmos that we call inert gases. So again, another variance from scientific orthodoxy. I would need a chemist on here to understand, and a physicist probably, to understand how compelling that is, but it's very interesting to me. He says the inert gases bear the same relationship to the elements that white bears to the colors. White is not included in the spectrum. It has no place there. The inert gases should not be included in the elements. They have no place there. All right, isn't that interesting? So we talked earlier about all of the colors of light. If you put them together, you end up with white light. So there seems like the absence of color. It's like there are no colors there. This is why you don't see white in the rainbow. It's like white isn't a color. It's the potential for colors. It's all the colors wrapped into one. It's the potential to be a color, but it's not a color. It shouldn't be included as an element. And he makes the same argument for the inert gases. It's like there is no actual motion there. It's just this motion and inertia. So they're not reactive. They're not acting like elements. Just like white is not acting like a color. It shouldn't be included. The inert gases shouldn't be included as elements. Isn't that interesting? Then he says, Mendeleev's periodic table, so this is the accepted one, he says, is correct only in the orderly periodicity of atomic weight. In all other dimensions, it's wrongly arranged. There is no eighth group. Many elements are out of place in octave periodicity. The inert gases of the zero group are incomplete, and 3.5 octaves are missing. Right, so you see that this is the difference between the Mendeleev table and his spiral table. He's like, look, I can see you've organized them by atomic weight, but there's other things going on here, and what Mendeleev has done is incomplete. It's all out of order. It has all these gaps in it. Now, I'm not a chemist. I don't have the ability to critique this idea, but I think it's very interesting. He says, the 10 octaves constitute a cycle of evolving states of motion. The cycle begins with the highest note and descends the scale sequentially through man's unseen universe until hydrogen, the first element perceivable to man, is reached. Those tones which follow hydrogen are man's physical universe of matter. Right, so remember, motion is important because motion is what is embedded in the light that makes it one thing and not another, that gives it form and makes it something. So he's talking about the 10 octaves constituting a cycle of motion, which begins at the highest note with the highest frequency and descends all the way through until you reach the first perceptible element of hydrogen. That means a couple things. It means that there's a world of reality that exists before you get to the level of frequency that we call hydrogen. There's all kinds of things going on before the motion is perceptible to us. Right? Because the frequency is increasing until we get to hydrogen. So whatever is before hydrogen is something, right? Motion is something because it's encoded in light, becomes something. It's something in the material world, but we just don't have access to it. And maybe that presumes the same is true on the other side of the frequency dynamic. Once we get beyond the realm of the elements that we know, maybe there's the reality continues beyond that somehow. And that brings me to the next section, which is our last one before the conclusion. This one I'm going to call Dancing Ouroboros. And Russell says, all motion is oscillatory, swinging between two apparently opposing forces, gravitation and repulsion, which are respectively electric and magnetic. So remember, all motion is taking place in this electromagnetic energy that radiates from the mind of God, and it's swinging back and forth between those opposites, electricity and magnetism. They're one thing, just like God is one thing. So this tension, this motion, this creative thing is happening within this unity. And he says as much. He says, these two forces are the mother-father forces of mind, which added together make the one force. One with a capital O. He's talking about God. He says, the universe is but the effect of these two apparently opposing forces, exerting their opposition. All motion in opposition is both gravitative and repulsive. Each opposite force is the cause of the other, right? So this is important because this is how the oneness is really going to sink in. Each opposite force is the cause of the other. So you've got this thing we're calling God or mind that's composed of, it's the Ouroboros, it's the mythological Ouroboros. It's composed of opposites in union. And there's this tension between those opposites, right in the middle there, right where Tiamat and Apsu, right? Those are the primordial gods of ancient Babylon. They were one thing in the beginning. And it was considered to be a generative act, a sexual act. These two opposites in union. And everything, they're basically giving birth in between them, right? And so when they finally part, the universe is there, and all of the gods and spirits and so forth are there. They've been created. This is what we're seeing, something like that being described by Walter Russell. Those two forces are the mother-father forces of mind, which added together make the one. They are the one. He says the universe is but the effect of these two apparently opposing forces exerting their opposition. So it's like they have no choice but to do that, right? If the negative and the positive, or the components of the magnet are unified, then you're going to have the same sort of push and pull that you feel with two different magnets. You're going to have sort of in the midst of this oneness. So all of the motion and the pushing and pulling is happening within this one thing. It's like self-perpetuating motion. That's this eternal living force that Russell's trying to talk about and describe as being responsible for the cosmos. Okay, and each opposite force is the cause of the other. So that's the idea of them being about imagining God as being self-created or eternal. Each opposite force is the cause of the other. They're mutually counter-dependent. You can't have one without the other. This is how we understand opposites to be, in fact, one thing. And they are. You can't have up without down. You can't have hot without cold. Why? Because they're one thing. If you get rid of up, down has no meaning. If you get rid of cold, hot has no meaning. They always are one thing fundamentally. All right. He says, opposition has no existence other than as an appearance. So this opposition here that we're talking about it's not real. It's one of these things he's calling an appearance, right? It's like when we were talking earlier about the motion being so important, and when it's in balance, the motion seems to go away. It seems to not exist. Well, that's what God is. God is the one thing, right? So there wouldn't be motion in that thing because it's in balance. So the opposition, the thing that we perceive as the engine of the motion of the material cosmos, that's only an appearance. So this goes back to this sort of idealism that I was talking about earlier. His philosophy is definitely idealistic, at least in some ways. He says in inertia, this appearance disappears, right? So when motion becomes potential, when it reaches that equilibrium or that balance, it seems to disappear. This is what I mean when I said God is one of those things that seems to not exist. But what it is potential. It's the potential for existence. He says matter is only an appearance due to states of motion. The creation of form in matter is the integration of those things which are and always have been. Creation is transmutation of the one indivisible substance into the appearance of many substances. Right? So the oneness is real and the multiplicity is appearance. All of the motion and distinction and differences, all of the stuff that we know of as the world of our experience is only appearance. When he says the creation of form in matter is the integration of those things which are and always have been, you might wonder what the hell does he mean by that? So form is important, right? Because when you're talking about something that is potential, in order for it to be real, actual, it needs to have form. It needs to have something that distinguishes it from the unity. And that's the thing we call form. This is what Plato meant when he talked about the world of forms. These are the ideas in the mind of God, or the archetypes, or the actual entities if you're going to Alfred North Whitehead. So the creation of form and matter, we earlier we talked about that being encoded in light, right? The form is the motion that's encoded in light that becomes matter. That's the form. It's the motion. That's what distinguishes it from something else, because it's a different motion. So when he says that the creation of form and matter is the integration of those things which are and always have been, well, the things that are and always have been are the thoughts of God, the archetypes, the things that give form to the formless. So that's what he means. It's the thoughts of God that get encoded in matter. That's the form. That's what's encoded in the light, in the electromagnetic energy. And he says creation is a transmutation. So the constant changing of motion is this transmuting and transfiguring and evolving process of the indivisible substance into the appearance of many substances. And then he tries to clarify this. He says matter is light crystallized or gravitationally assembled into the appearance of form. Matter is light crystallized. So light, we think of something as numinous and immaterial, but light becoming material. That's what he means by that. Light, with the right motion, with that form applied to it, transforms from something numinous to something material. And he attributes this to gravitation. So one of those forces. I don't know if he was associating that with electricity or magnetism, but one of those forces. He says all matter is but a variation of the state of light waves, which is something we more or less agree with in modern science. All matter is but a variation of the state of light waves. Lastly, he says, change does not belong to substance, but to motion. Man lives in a universe of motion, a universe of appearances and illusions which deceive him. Form and motion are illusions. They are fleeting. They are effects. Right? So that points to something that isn't illusion. It entails something that is real. And that ultimately real thing, behind the appearances and the illusions, that's the unity that we call God. The thing that a mystic identifies with himself and everything else. But certainly that's what the revelation is. It's coming to realize that unity is something that is indistinguishable from you at the most fundamental level. That you are, in some sense, this permanent, unchanging substance, as well as the illusion of motion and matter and reality. Some combination of those things, like the union of opposites, like the Ouroboros that we call God. And that brings me to my conclusion. A couple of thoughts. First, it's clear to me that most of the compelling but unorthodox scientific ideas Terrance Howard described on Joe's podcast came directly from the work of Walter Russell. Now, Terrance admitted as much, but also suggested that these ideas were revealed to him in a mystical experience, just as Russell did. So, whether this is a case of plagiarism or of common inspiration is impossible to say. Secondly, Russell's work is absolutely brimming with the topics that I love the most, like the recoupling of science and religion, mystical enlightenment, and divine unity. Russell checks all the boxes. His insistence upon the tension of opposing forces as the creative mechanism in the world reminds me simultaneously of the Ouroboros of our ancient myths, of Carl Jung's syzygy, and of Alfred North Whitehead's conception of the world as a perpetually evolving process. We see echoes of Plato's nous and his notion of God as mind, and of Hindu-style idealism and his description of form and change as illusion. We see the fractal nature of reality in his description of endlessly unfolding octaves. In his unification of matter and spirit, we recognize the philosophy of panpsychism and in his insistence on the immanence of God in the cosmos. We recognize pantheism or panentheism. But the common source for all of these models, from antiquity to the modern time, is, of course, the mystic experience, which is the revelation of that ultimate unity, that oneness. And Russell was, after all, a mystic. We can therefore place Russell, I think, in the stream of prophets that have been bringing this message to humanity repeatedly over the eons. There was Pythagoras and Parmenides, Lao Tzu and Shankara, Jesus and Buddha, Hegel and Whitehead, and now apparently the likes of Walter Russell and Terrance Howard. But if I had to hone in on just one or two things that made the biggest impression on me, I point to Russell's grappling with the paradox of fundamental unity and the significance he places on light. When Russell describes light as the, quote, substance of God, I can't help but remember the philosopher Swedenborg, who in the 18th century said very similar things. Swedenborg had a mystical vision that the stars are portals connecting the divine and material realms, and that the light pouring forth from them is literally the divine transmuted into energy, which forms the material world. Add to this things like the Gnostics calling themselves, quote, we who come from the light, and the biblical insistence that the light of God is the life of men. We're off to the races. I mean, for Russell, light, or more precisely, electromagnetic energy, are the thoughts of God. They manifest in reality merely by being thought. And the form they take depends on the form of that thought. This makes the dark expanse of space identical to the dark expanse of imagination. It makes our lived experience, in fact, all of experience, communion with the deity.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.